standing out in a cornfield right now, and in this particular corn, it's probably a little early to be looking for some of the real late season bugs that we might see, but we wanted to talk about what you should be scouting for in mid-July on your farm, or maybe even into early August.
Well, it's interesting. As corn plants get bigger and they start tasseling and flowering, all kinds of insects come in for basically a feeding frenzy in the cornfields. The question is it worth treating for them? Are they going to do a lot of damage for you?
Yep.
Where do we start?
Okay, well, let's start by talking about grasshoppers a little bit. You know, back real early this spring, people all around the country were so worried about grasshoppers because the numbers were pretty high that they were finding then. The problem is, in terms of grasshopper survivability, it's not nearly as good in wetter conditions, and for the most part, the entire country has been relatively wet this year. So the grasshopper numbers aren't going to take off, but in a cornfield, what I really worry about is, let's say the guy right next to my cornfield has a wheat field and he starts harvesting that wheat. Well, even though our grasshopper numbers aren't going to be nearly as big as we thought, there's still a lot of grasshoppers in a wheat field, and when you harvest that whole wheat field, where do those grasshoppers have to go? There's nothing.
Wherever it's green.
That's right, wherever it's green, and chances are your cornfield is looking nice and green at that point, so they're gonna move in like a swarm. So what we would suggest is bordering the field. In other words, you can spray the ditches, you can spray the first few rows of the cornfield to nail those grasshoppers before they move in and take over your field.
I'm not worried about grasshoppers and the endrills. I'm worried about something that's going to get across the whole field. Like, let's talk about corn rootworm beetles, for example.
Yep.
They are out there as rootworm larvae early in the year. They're feeding on the roots, they're little worms, and then all of a sudden they get to that adult stage, which is a beetle, and they emerge from the ground.
There are many different kinds of adult corn rootworm beetles. There's northern corn rootworm beetles, the westerns, the southerns. It doesn't really make that much difference. They can all do about the same amount of damage. Now, before we get into the damage they do to corn at this point, let's talk about the damage they did earlier. If you're seeing lots of adult corn rootworm beetles, I hate to break it to you, but whatever you used for an insecticide or any kind of seed treatment, anything, it didn't kill all your rootworms, and you had rootworm damage this year. So you shouldn't see many adult corn rootworm beetles later on. If you do, you know that whatever you were using earlier didn't work.
Well, you also know that you're probably going to have some stalk rot issues, and you're probably going to have some corn that doesn't really stand all that well if you get some tough weather later on in the season. Think about it. You put a great big ear on that corn plant, that's a lot of weight. When the wind gets blowing, if you've got some storms or something like that, if those stalks aren't real strong, you don't have a good root mass below you, you're going to have trouble. And also, as we kind of mentioned with soybean aphids earlier in the show, once you've got that feeding, you're going to have disease that gets in, which is going to result in stalk rot in corn.
Okay, the biggest problem or the biggest concern we have with adult corn rootworm beetles is they will feed on the silks, and they'll feed down so much that the silks can't get pollinated. So that's when we're really worried about adult corn rootworm beetles, but you would have to have several per plant feeding on those silks and cutting them right down to the ear. The odds of that happening are pretty slim. We rarely spray for adult corn rootworm beetles for that reason.
Okay, now when Brian got out of college, he was working for a company and mainly working with insecticides and doing a lot of scouting. And there was an insect called corn leaf aphids that Brian got a little excited about, and then he got shot down. And people were saying, no, don't worry about corn leaf aphids. Well, just a few years ago, I told Brian, you know, hey, I'm seeing a lot of corn leaf aphids again around the country. I'm excited about this. And Brian started shooting me down, saying, Darren, corn leaf aphids aren't that big a deal.
No, they weren't that big a deal, but the thing is, when I got done with college back like in the late 1800s, you know, corn wasn't worth much.
It's about a quarter a bushel
and
or
it
something.
cost a lot of money to spray. Well, now insecticides are super cheap, and our corn crop is worth about 5 times as much. So it's whole different. It's just changed the economics. We talk about economic threshold all the time. With corn leaf aphids, the economic threshold is dramatically different because the value of the crop and the cost of the treatment. The other thing with corn leaf aphids is they're much more of a problem in a drier year. When we have inadequate moisture, they can usually cause 3 or 4 times the amount of damage that they can in a wetter year, just because of all the ample growth that's out here. So in a wetter year, we're not that concerned about it, but still you've got to be scouting.
Okay, well, here's the thing I'm concerned about in wetter years. You end up with a lot of aphids right around that tassel, and now in wetter years, you end up with more disease problems usually too. So now we've got this plant with all these little open wounds, and you end up with more disease pressure. This can be a big deal.
Yep, that's true. So what we're saying is, if you have a lot of corn leaf aphid problems, you probably will want to spray some fungicide at the same time. But again, just scout your fields. whether it's for corn leaf aphids, adult corn rootworm beetles, or grasshoppers.
One last thing, Brian, is I don't look at just the threshold for one and say, well, you know, I don't have enough leaf aphids to do it. Ooh, I almost have enough rootworm beetles to do it. Ooh, I've got just a few grasshoppers out there too. I kind of combine all those things together and say, you know what, if you've got pressure from multiple insects, you may not have to hit a threshold on any individual one insect. If you've got lots of insect pressure, definitely spray.
Well, the same thing is true for our weed of the week. If you have that, plus a number of others, it's really bad. But just our weed of the week is a terrible one. We'll tell you why coming up next.